Hi Year 10 and welcome to another narrated PowerPoint from me. This week we're looking at 7A and 7B, which is about comparing viewpoints and perspectives. So to start with, just to get your brains warmed up, I'd like you to think about an apple and an orange. Just quickly pause the PowerPoint and see whether you can just jot down 6 similarities between these fruit, and then when you've done that, see if you can find some differences as well. So pause the PowerPoint and have a go at that. Well done. Now have a look at these two adorable creatures, see if you can do the same thing. So you're looking for similarities, so it might be something like they both have noses, they both have ears, they're both domestic pets, and then see if you can find the differences. So again, pause the PowerPoint and have a go at that, please. So if you were doing the apples and oranges, you might have come up with these sorts of similarities. You might have also come up with something else that is different to that. But you can see that the similarities use the word both. They both are circular, they both grow on trees, whereas you'll find that the way that you need to articulate the differences will be a little bit more complex. And we can see the same thing here for the cats and dogs comparison. So the similarities tend to be quite straightforward things that are quite obvious and leap out at us, whereas the differences take a little bit more thinking about. And I'll be interested to hear the similarities and differences that you came up with. So, having warmed up your brain and made sure that your minds are awake and lively, we're going to have a specific think about 7A and 7B. So just as we've seen with the cats and the dogs and the apples and the oranges, 7A is about similarities, whereas 7B is about both differences and similarities, and you're asked to compare the writer's viewpoints and perspectives. 7A and 7B are a real discriminator of a question. So what I mean by that is that this question will make a difference as to whether you hit your highest potential grade or not. Paper 2 is a discriminator in and of itself. It's definitely the hardest part of the qualification, and I think 7B is probably the hardest question on the qualification. One of the main problems with 7A and particularly with 7B is that students run out of time. Okay, so what we're doing today is we're developing a really clear understanding of the demands of the question so that you understand the mark scheme, you understand how you're assessed, and then you're going to be able to do it quickly and methodically. So before we move on with looking at the rest of the resources, I'm assuming at this point that you are familiar with the texts 127 Hours and The Return of Shackleton from the Weddell Sea. If you're not familiar with them, you need to take a little bit of time to reread the text. They're on the next slide. It would be a good idea, just again to keep your brain warmed up and elastic, just to jot down a 5-point bullet point summary of what happens in each text, just so that you can remember and you're engaged with them before we start drilling down into doing some further work. So here's a reminder of the texts. You also have these in your remote learning pack, and it's probably better to read them there and make notes as you go, but they're here if you need them. So now let's get on to what 7A actually looks like. It's like this. You're given about, well, it's between half a page and 3/4 of a page in order to write the question response. You don't need that space. Most people do use the overwhelming majority of it, but I have seen lots of people attempt this question and do very well, not filling every line. If you ask for extra paper for this, you've probably written too much, so just be a little bit wary about that. These are really easy marks. Everybody ought to be able to get at least 4 marks on this question. So let's find out about how. So I've repeated the question here for you. They make a statement. The 2 texts show some of the events that happened on expeditions. So they've just introduced that word expeditions as the key word for the question. What similarities do the expeditions share in these extracts? And you need to use evidence from both texts to support your answer. So what we're looking for is a series of 3 or 4, you don't need to do any more than that, statements that start with the word both. And then you're going to find a piece of evidence from text 1 and a piece of evidence from text 2 to demonstrate that similarity, and then you will move on. On this slide, I've just outlined that a little bit more clearly for you. So it is important that you keep an eye open for that key word in the question. So as I discussed on the previous slide, it's expedition. So sometimes they will ask you about the places or the experiences or perhaps the people. But in this particular paper, the key word that they're giving you is expeditions. So that's got to be our focus. So we're going to write some both statements about the texts, and when we've written our both statement, we are going to try to add in a short piece of evidence from each text. So I literally would start this question by writing 4 bullet points down the side of your gap on your paper that say both, 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 both. So in a moment you're going to have a go at this, but I just wanted to show you the generic mark scheme for the piece first of all. So to get 1 to 2 marks, you've just got to show limited understanding of similarities. So if you come up with 1 similarity and maybe 1 piece of evidence, you might even get 2 if you did it quite well. Most people, according to the examiner, do manage to get into level 2. So they get between 3 or 4 marks for this question. So you need to show clear synthesis. Well, I've put an explanation of what synthesis means here. It's kind of being able to get an overview, being able to combine and pull together ideas from various parts of the text. So it's a reasonably complicated skill. That was a big bin lorry just going past my house there. So most people get into that band, but then for level 3, you need to show detailed understanding of the similarities and a detailed synthesis of the 2 texts. But you need to not worry at all about saying anything about how they're different. That just doesn't come into this question. Okay, so having given you a bit of an indication about how you go about it, I would suggest that you give yourself 8 minutes at this point and you have a go at this question. I would suggest that you pause the PowerPoint and just have a go at doing it in about 8 minutes. So here's the mark scheme. These are the things that the examiner thinks that you might have chosen. The examiner does have a little bit of license within that. So if you come up with a similarity that is sound and that is evidence from both parts of the text, then it would be absolutely fine. So if you've had a go, have a look at your answers and see whether you might have picked up a full set of marks. So you wouldn't need to have said about all of these similarities. As I say, 3 or 4 would be absolutely sufficient. They don't expect you to come up with the 7 points that they have come up with here. So we're going to move on and look at 7b now. Do you remember earlier I was saying that this question 7a and 7b tends to be one that students run out of time for? I think that's particularly the case for 7b because it's the last question on the reading section before you go on to do writing. So just like the other relatively long questions in the booklet, you are given 3 pages to write your answer. You do not have to write 3 pages. Again, that's probably for people with relatively large handwriting. You should be aiming to write between about 1.5 pages to 2 pages to be successful. You need to answer this question, you're looking for the similarities and the differences. You need to try to step back and sum up the ideas, the situations, the viewpoints, and explore them. You need to be comparing. You have to remember to quote. You need to think about who wrote the text and for what purpose. So before we have a go at that, and before I give you some more top tips, I just wanted to outline the mark scheme for you. So again, we've got this idea of limited, some comment, some explanation, and then it going into exploration and a comprehensive perceptive analysis. So I think the key thing is here that if you run out of time and you only write about one text, you will not get more than 5 out of 14. So it's very important for you to open by writing a sentence which is about both texts. I'm interested here as well in the middle bit of the mark scheme where it says the response considers a range of comparisons. Well, we need to think, what is a range? I think that a range is at least 3 comparisons, but the best answers will probably find 6 or more points of comparison, and that will be because they're showing really, really good synthesis and they're thinking about a range of different ways, a wide range of different ways that the texts and their viewpoints and perspectives can be compared. So this is a mnemonic that I invented to help you answer this question. I think it's just, again, you don't have to do every letter in the mnemonic. Some of them will be more useful to you than others. But if you're tired towards the end of the exam and you're thinking, oh, what am I supposed to write about for this question? It can be handy just to have this, just to jog your brain and help you remember the sorts of things that you might want to be writing about. So it's probably worth pausing the PowerPoint and noting those down. So I've used that mnemonic, FLAPPIEST, just as a basis for beginning to write down some notes about comparing the two pieces. So I suggest you pause the PowerPoint, you make a similar table yourself, and you have a go at just pulling out some of the key ideas about the forms, the language, the primary purpose, what's the main thing it was written for, whose perspective is it from, who has written it, when did they write it, what were they trying to achieve, and that sort of thing. So it would be a good idea for you to just take a little bit of time to think about jotting down some ideas against these questions yourselves. So here we have a sort of partially completed one of those tables. As I say, I think it's unrealistic for you to be able to write about every aspect of the flappiest mnemonic in the 20 minutes that you would realistically have in the exam. So you can see here that just by jotting down some ideas, you have got 5 points of comparison, which would easily satisfy a range. And we've got some good ideas for the sorts of things that we could write about. So if you want to make a start and you were struggling for your own ideas, you could try to use these as a starting point. Here I've got a much more developed set of ideas. I wouldn't recommend in an exam that you actually waste the time planning your ideas like this. As I say, it's just a way for you to kind of cement your thinking, and while we're still in the learning phase of you approaching a question like this, it's a good exercise to kind of train your mind for thinking about the viewpoints and perspectives, the differences and similarities, and the sorts of things that you might end up talking about. So this one is completed in a little bit more detail. Well, I think we've had plenty of idea to get your heads around the similarities and the differences. Hopefully, Flappiest has been somewhat helpful to you. Now it's time to go over to you to have a go at actually answering the question. Remember, 1.5 pages, 2 pages ought to be plenty. I have just put some notes down here just to remind you, you must compare, you must quote, you must think about who wrote the text and for what purpose. it's a really good idea for you to make sure that you include a comparative statement about both texts in the opening. So you could say something like, whilst Ralston's expedition is to a canyon, Shackleton's expedition is to cross Antarctica, or something that just makes some reference to both texts, so that will help you hit the comparison and nudge you into at least grade or level 3. So just another final reminder that in the exam you would need to do this response in about 20 minutes, but while you're learning, don't be worried if it takes you sort of 35-40 minutes to have a go at something like this. Those of you that have seen my previous narrated PowerPoints will know that I often like to include some exemplar answers and commentaries, so that's what you've got coming up now. We're going to have a look at this one now. In text 1, the expedition is more interesting than in text 2. In text 1, the writer sounds like he's really stuck and he has no one else with him when his hand is stuck, my arm vanishing into a small gap. In text 1, it talks about how he's in a bad panic and the time slows down. Time dilates as if I'm dreaming, and it shows really well how when you have a bad accident, sometimes things go really trippy and weird. In text 2, it's much more boring. Okay, so the main issue with this one is that they don't really talk about text 2 at all, other than saying really vague things like it's not as interesting or it's boring. So they make an attempt to comment on both texts, but they don't really compare. So this would score just into a level 2. It's lifted there slightly by the fact that it has included quotations quite well. So this one would get 3 out of 14. And then we've got our full marks example here. I'm not going to read it to you. It continues on to the next slide. I think what is quite interesting about this one is that you can see the thread of flappiest, or comments that kind of link into some of the ideas in flappiest kind of do follow throughout the answer, and I think that's quite helpful in showing you how flappiest can be a useful way in which to structure your response. So here's the mark scheme from the exam board. As you can see, it's not hugely extensive. These are the sorts of things that they think that you could have said. I think the previous answer actually goes above and beyond that, and that's one of the reasons why it does achieve full marks. So I hope that's been useful for you. Good luck writing your own responses, and I shall look forward to reading them. Later on in the week, I will do a similar approach to the Bert and Jack paper for 7A for 7B. So if you feel confident having watched this, great, go for it, have a go at the Jack and Bert paper, 7A and 7B. But if you feel like you need a little bit more help, it is my full intention to make a similar slideshow in support of that question. Thank you for watching.